December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow drifts through the shattered trees. The air is frozen, silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. Along a narrow trail deep in Belgium's winter, a small American column crawls forward. Tanks stall in the icy sludge, engines choking in the cold. Men slip, curse drag supplies through the snow. Then through the white haze, a low growl cuts the silence. A squat little vehicle pushes through the drifts, 4 soldiers packed tight, faces crusted with frost. The driver wrestles the wheel, tires spinning, but the machine keeps moving. Over roots, through ice, past wrecks twice its size. A German officer watching from a captured farmhouse window lowers his binoculars. His lips curl in disbelief. That tiny American contraption, no armor, no size, no glory, moves where his trucks had failed. That toy he had once laughed at. Now, it was carrying an army through hell. And it all began years earlier when the U.S. Army issued a desperate call for something that didn't yet exist. The search for a new kind of vehicle, it began quietly, far from the battlefields that would later define its legend. In early 1940, as Europe trembled under the roar of German blitzkrieg, the United States Army found itself facing a sobering truth. It had no fast, light, all-terrain vehicle capable of keeping up with modern war. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's divisions were rewriting the rules of warfare. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads sliced through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying precision. The world watched columns of panzer tanks supported by motorcycles and half-tracks advance with machine-like coordination. Their communication, movement, and flexibility stunned even veteran officers. Every German offensive seemed to flow effortlessly fast, unpredictable, and unstoppable. Meanwhile, in America, the U.S. Army was still largely on horseback. Scouts rode motorcycles that tipped in mud. Officers traveled in modified sedans that broke down off-road. Infantrymen walked mile after mile through the dust. It wasn't just inefficient. It was dangerous. In the coming global war, speed would mean survival. By the spring of 1940, the Army Ordnance Department issued a request that seemed almost impossible. They needed a light reconnaissance car, small enough for 2 men to lift, strong enough to carry weapons and gear, and agile enough to cross any terrain. The requirements were staggering: 4-wheel drive, 600-pound payload, under 75 inches wide, able to climb 45-degree slopes and wade through streams. And it had to be ready in just 49 days. Only 3 companies dared to attempt it: Bantam Car Company, Willys Overland, and Ford Motor Company. The smallest, Bantam, was the first to respond. A handful of engineers working in a small Pennsylvania workshop burned through nights to craft a prototype. Against all odds, the Bantam reconnaissance car was delivered on time. It looked fragile, but it moved like nothing the Army had seen. Light, fast, able to twist over rocks and mud. Still, there was a problem. Bantam was tiny. It couldn't mass-produce thousands of vehicles for war. The Army turned to Willys and Ford, asking them to refine Bantam's idea, using their industrial power to bring it to life. At Willys Overland, engineer Delmar Barney Roos saw potential. He reworked the design, adding a powerful Go Devil engine and reinforcing the frame. The result was a boxy, rugged, unpretentious machine, simple in design, yet full of purpose. When the first Willys MB prototype rolled out for Army testing, observers were skeptical. It looked too plain, too small, too odd. But once it moved, bounding over obstacles and splashing through mud, the laughter stopped. By the end of 1941, the design was chosen. Ford would build it alongside Willys to meet demand. The vehicle was officially named the Willys MB, but soldiers soon gave it a simpler name: the Jeep. Few could imagine what that name would come to mean. To the American soldier, it would be freedom on 4 wheels. To their enemies, an enigma that defied the elements. And to Hitler's officers, who once mocked its fragile frame, it would become a quiet symbol of Allied persistence, the little machine that simply refused to stop. But before it could conquer Europe's mud and snow, the Jeep would first have to prove itself in deserts, jungles, and mountains across the vast, unforgiving front lines of a world at war. By late 1941, the world had changed. The United States had entered the war, its industries roaring to life with a speed unseen in history. Factories that once made cars, stoves, and tractors now built tanks, guns, and bombers. Amid this storm of production, a small box-shaped vehicle began rolling off the assembly lines by the thousands, the Willys MB, the U.S. Army's new light reconnaissance car. It was simple. Squared edges, flat fenders, no comforts. But soldiers quickly learned what it was capable of. In the African desert, it skimmed over sand where heavy trucks bogged down. In the jungles of the Pacific, it climbed ridges slick with rain. It hauled ammo, pulled guns, carried stretchers, towed trailers, and ferried officers across battle zones. The Jeep was small enough to fit inside a transport aircraft or be lifted by glider into the front lines. At first, German officers laughed. Captured intelligence reports from 1942 show how some Wehrmacht observers mocked it as a child's toy or a mechanical mule. The sight of American soldiers riding open, unarmored, in these tiny vehicles seemed absurd to armies built on steel and precision engineering. To them, this crude machine was no match for a Panzer or a Kübelwagen. But war is not won by looks. It's won by reliability, adaptability, and movement. And the Jeep delivered all three. As the first American units landed in North Africa, the Germans began to notice something strange. Where their own supply trucks stalled in dunes, the Jeeps kept moving. They ran on simple parts, burned poor quality fuel, and could be repaired in the field with a wrench and a bit of wire. When larger vehicles failed, Jeeps became lifelines carrying water, messages, and men through the chaos of desert warfare. Field reports from the British Eighth Army praised it as the most valuable vehicle ever created. General Eisenhower would later call it one of the four tools that won the war, alongside the C-47 transport plane, the bazooka, and the atomic bomb. By 1943, production had exploded. Ford and Willys together were turning out nearly 10,000 Jeeps a month. Assembly lines ran day and night, workers knowing that each vehicle shipped meant another soldier had a better chance of coming home alive. The machine's design became a symbol of American efficiency. No frills, no waste, just pure function. The Jeep's presence began to define Allied mobility. In Italy's Rocky Hills, it carried commanders like Patton and Clark across mined roads. In Burma, it snaked through jungles where no truck could pass. Mechanics even modified them into rail cars, firefighting rigs, and mobile field radios. The vehicle adapted to every landscape from the heat of Tunisia to the monsoon rains of the Pacific, and the enemy noticed. German prisoners began calling it Der kleine amerikanische Panzerwagen, the little American armored car. They had once laughed at it. Now they are trying to copy it. When German engineers studied captured Jeeps, they were astonished by its simplicity. There was no mystery in its parts, no secret weaponry, only clarity of purpose. Every bolt, every panel, every curve existed for one reason: to keep moving. As Allied plans shifted toward the invasion of Europe, the Jeep became inseparable from the image of the American soldier. It was the first vehicle ashore, the last to leave, a bridge between the factory and the front line, between invention and survival. By the eve of D-Day, the Allies had shipped more than 200,000 Jeeps overseas. They would soon roll across the beaches of Normandy, push through the mud of France, and climb into the frozen forests of Belgium. The little machine, once mocked by Hitler's officers, was about to face the true test of Europe's brutal winter and the unforgiving mud of war. The Willys Jeep was never meant to look heroic. It wasn't armored, it wasn't fast, and it certainly wasn't beautiful. Yet its greatness lay in what it did and what it never failed to do. The technological angle simplicity that conquered complexity, unlike Germany's advanced machines bristling with gears, optics, and specialized parts. The Jeep's design philosophy was the opposite. Keep it simple enough to fix in a field with one wrench. Under fire. Its Go Devil 4-cylinder engine delivered just 60 horsepower. On paper, it was unimpressive. But the secret was its power-to-weight ratio and four-wheel drive system. It could climb slopes that stopped heavier vehicles cold, ford streams up to 2 feet deep, and keep traction through deep mud where even tanks bogged down. Every line of its frame served a function. Flat body panels weren't a stylistic choice. They allowed for easy repairs and fast production. Fold-down windshields reduced glare and made it easier to transport. Even the round headlights were positioned to fit blackout covers for night driving. The suspension, a simple leaf spring design, was rugged and forgiving. It could take punishment mile after mile over cobblestones, mud tracks, and cratered roads. When a part broke, soldiers didn't need a specialist. A Jeep could be stripped and rebuilt by its own crew with spare parts scavenged from another wreck. It was a triumph of utility over luxury, the perfect machine for a war that demanded endurance, not elegance, and then there was its versatility. The same chassis could mount a machine gun, carry a radio, haul ammunition, or tow an anti-tank gun. The Jeep could even serve as an ambulance, its back seat removed and stretchers tied to the frame. There were Jeeps that laid communication lines, sprayed insecticide, pulled artillery, and acted as makeshift fire trucks. To an officer, it was transport. To a medic, it was a lifeline. To the infantrymen, it was freedom. The human angle. A soldier's best friendmen grew attached to their Jeeps in ways that no one at the factory could have predicted. Soldiers named them Old Faithful, Lil Abner, the Rattler. They decorated them with chalk drawings, flags, and bullet holes patched with tin. In the chaos of war, the Jeep became a constant something that always started when everything else didn't. For many, the Jeep was the difference between life and death. In the mud of Anzio, it delivered stretchers from the front lines when no ambulance could reach. In the hedgerows of Normandy, it carried ammunition under fire. In the frozen Ardennes, it brought hot rations and mail to soldiers who hadn't seen warmth in weeks. One soldier wrote home, "You can break a man before you can break a Jeep." Another said, "It's the only machine that feels alive out here." The emotional connection was real. These small vehicles shared every hardship their crews faced. The dust, the cold, the noise. When the war ended, many soldiers wept as their units ordered the Jeeps left behind, burned, or handed to local forces. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It had become part of their story, and perhaps that's what made it so uniquely American. Where the German soldier relied on discipline and the machine for precision, the American soldier relied on adaptability, and the Jeep fit that spirit perfectly. It didn't demand ideal conditions. It didn't need polished roads or perfect fuel. It simply worked anywhere, anytime, for anyone. It represented the industrial might of the U.S., yes, but also its philosophy. Build something for the common man, and let it do uncommon things. By the time the Jeep reached Europe, its reputation had already spread. Allied troops traded cigarettes just to get rides in them. Civilians cheered as convoys passed. Children clung to their bumpers for joy rides. The machine that started as an experiment had become a symbol of motion, freedom, and hope. And across enemy lines, in bunkers and headquarters, German officers began to notice this strange, unstoppable swarm of small American vehicles appearing everywhere in places no car should be. Their engineers had built for dominance. America was built for persistence, and in war, persistence always wins. The tactical angle. The vehicle that moved an army, the Jeep didn't just move soldiers. It moved strategies. Before its arrival, Allied mobility depended heavily on trucks and half-tracks effective on roads, but vulnerable and clumsy off them. The Jeep changed that balance overnight. It became the backbone of small unit warfare, enabling fast reconnaissance, flexible command movement, and last-minute resupply under fire. Platoon leaders could now move quickly between squads spread across miles of broken terrain. Commanders could observe battlefields from forward positions without waiting for roads to clear. In North Africa, British commandos used Jeeps for lightning raids across German supply lines, darting in, firing, and vanishing into dunes before enemy patrols could respond. In Italy, Jeeps carried engineers into mined roads to repair bridges under fire. In France, they became mobile communication hubs small enough to slip through hedgerows, powerful enough to carry radios that kept divisions connected. The tactical advantage wasn't just speed, it was adaptability. Jeeps could operate independently in pairs or in convoys. They carried everything from machine guns to rocket launchers, making them the Swiss Army knife of the Allied ground war. By late 1943, no operation, no matter how large or small, happened without them. Even the airborne divisions relied on them. In glider operations, Jeeps were stripped down, folded, and flown directly into combat zones. Paratroopers would land, unfold the machines, and be mobile within minutes, a feat no other army could replicate at that time. The Jeep had become something the enemy feared: unpredictability. An American patrol in Jeeps could appear from a forest, a swamp, or a ridge that German maps labeled impassable. The terrain no longer protected the defender. It was now part of the battlefield that the Allies could own. The enemy angle. The mockery turns to admiration. When German officers first encountered the Jeep, they laughed. Reports from captured soldiers and intercepted radio chatter reveal phrases like primitive and toy-like. The Wehrmacht's pride rested in its engineering excellence. Precise machines like the Kubelwagen and Schwimmwagen, both designed by Ferdinand Porsche and built by Volkswagen, they were well-made, efficient, and quintessentially German. But they weren't built for chaos. Their air-cooled engines struggled in deep snow. Their low clearance caught on rocks and mud, and their repair systems required specialized tools and trained mechanics luxuries the crumbling German front lines could no longer afford. The Jeep, in comparison, was crude but unstoppable. It didn't require precision, it required resilience. German officers began capturing and reusing Jeeps whenever they could. Some divisions repainted them in field gray and used them as command cars. Others disassembled them to learn their secrets. One Wehrmacht engineering report noted, "The American light car can cross terrain that our light trucks cannot. Its construction is primitive but highly effective." By 1944, German propaganda had stopped mocking the Jeep. Instead, their officers quietly envied it as a product of a nation that understood mass production and modular design better than anyone else. The very thing they dismissed as industrial simplicity was what kept the Allies moving while German convoys froze in the snow. To the German soldier, the Jeep became a ghostly symbol. Wherever the Allies advanced, these small vehicles seemed to appear, first rolling past wrecked tanks, splashing through craters, carrying men who looked impossibly alive after days of fighting. It wasn't a machine of destruction. It was a machine of endurance, something the German war machine in all its brilliance had overlooked. The moral angle. The spirit of ingenuity. Every great war has a weapon that captures its soul. For Germany, it was the Panzer tank, cold, mechanical, and powerful. For America, it was the Jeep, modest, practical, and human. It reflected the moral character of the Allied war effort, innovation through necessity, courage through simplicity. The Jeep wasn't designed by a genius inventor or funded by a vast scientific program. It was born from a collective idea, an urgent need answered by many hands, built by ordinary workers who understood that perfection wasn't the goal. Reliability was. Each one of those vehicles carried the fingerprints of welders, mechanics, and factory women, the riveters who built them by the thousands. When a Jeep reached the front lines, it wasn't just a machine. It was a connection between home and the battlefield. Soldiers often said driving one felt like touching the industrial heart of America. In that sense, the Jeep was more than a tactical advantage. It was a moral message that strength doesn't always come from complexity, but from unity and purpose. It didn't intimidate. It endured. It didn't crush. It carried. And that made it something more powerful than a weapon. It became a symbol of the Allied will. By the time winter came to Europe in 1944, that will was about to be tested like never before. Snow, ice, and chaos would soon turn the fields of Belgium into a graveyard for machines, all except one. December 1944. The Allies had believed the war in Europe was nearly over. Paris was liberated. The front stretched deep into Belgium. Troops were exhausted but confident until, before dawn on December 16th, the horizon erupted in fire. Hitler had struck back. In a desperate gamble, he unleashed 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks into the frozen forests of the Ardennes. It was his last great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Snow buried the landscape. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Roads vanished beneath sheets of ice and mud. American units were scattered, surrounded, or overrun. And in that chaos, mobility meant survival. The roads through the Ardennes were never meant for war. They twisted through dense pines, dipped into ravines, and turned into rivers of slush when the snow began to melt. Heavy trucks stalled. Tanks spun their treads helplessly. Even half-tracks struggled. But the small, stubborn Jeep, that unlikely machine of steel and spirit, refused to yield. All along the front, it became the artery of the Allied defense. In the 101st Airborne Division's besieged perimeter around Bastogne, Jeeps carried ammunition and rations through roads shelled day and night. Their drivers, hunched over frozen steering wheels, steered by instinct more than sight. When fuel trucks couldn't pass, Jeeps delivered jerry cans. When medics couldn't reach the wounded, Jeeps became ambulances with 2 stretchers strapped across the hood and rear. bumping through shell fire to the field hospitals. Soldiers described the Jeep's engine sound as a heartbeat in the cold. In the stillness of the forest, when everything seemed lost, that steady rumble meant supplies were coming. It meant help was near. At one crossroad near St. Vith, German armor cut off an entire American convoy. Trucks burned. The snow glowed orange. A group of soldiers in jeeps turned off the main road, pushing into the woods, hacking branches aside to carve their own route. They emerged miles away, battered but alive, the only vehicles to make it through. Their report simply read, "Jeep route established. Even the weather couldn't kill it." Engines froze solid at night. Men lit fires under the oil pans just to start them again. They wrapped radiators in blankets, filled gearboxes with melted candles when oil ran low. And still the little machines rolled. The Jeep didn't just carry men, it carried morale. Its silhouette in the snow became a symbol of endurance, a reminder that no matter how deep the mud, the war would keep moving forward. Photographs from that winter showed Jeeps half buried in ice, headlights covered, tires wrapped in chains, drivers smiling through exhaustion. It was the smile of men who trusted their machine. The German army, too, saw this resilience. Captured reports noted American light vehicles moving in terrain impossible for mechanical operation. One Wehrmacht officer wrote, "They do not stop. They go where we cannot." In Bastogne, as General Patton's Third Army pushed north through sleet and blizzard to relieve the trapped paratroopers, the Jeep led the charge, skidding across frozen rivers, hauling supplies, dragging the wounded. When the skies finally cleared and Allied air power returned, the Jeeps became scouts again, guiding tanks and infantry through shattered roads. Every victory, every rescue, every breakthrough, a Jeep was there. By January 1945, when the snow finally began to melt, thousands of Jeeps stood lined along the roads of Belgium and Luxembourg, mud-caked, bullet-pocked, engines still ticking in the cold. They had done what no other vehicle could. Where trucks failed, they carried. Where tanks stalled, they climbed. And where hope faltered, they moved. For the Germans who had once laughed at this child's toy, the Ardennes was a revelation. They saw it not as a vehicle, but as a symbol of Allied persistence. The little machine that refused to stop was now the face of an army that refused to surrender. And as the snow gave way to thawing mud, the Jeep would push again, this time across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany itself. When the snows of the Ardennes melted in early 1945, the fields of Europe turned into a sea of mud. Villages lay in ruins. Roads had been pulverized by months of bombardment. The once mighty Wehrmacht was retreating, but the terrain, soaked, cratered, and frozen, threatened to slow the Allied advance. Yet, through the sludge and wreckage, came the sound of hundreds of small engines, the same sound that had echoed through Africa's deserts and Italy's hillsides. The Jeep was still leading the way. Everywhere across the front, these nimble machines became the vanguard of the Allied push into Germany. Tanks couldn't advance without reconnaissance, and reconnaissance couldn't happen without the Jeep. They moved ahead of the columns, crossing rivers, probing enemy lines, marking safe paths through minefields and debris. At Remagen, when American forces discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing across the Rhine on March 7, 1945, the first vehicles to cross it weren't tanks or trucks. They were Jeeps. Photographs from that moment show them edging across the damaged steel span, water mist rising from the river below, soldiers gripping their rifles against the wind. Behind them came the armor, the artillery, and the endless columns of men, all guided by those tiny four-wheeled scouts. The Rhine crossing was more than a tactical achievement. It was psychological. For years, the Rhine had been Germany's sacred barrier, the line Hitler vowed no enemy would cross. Yet it wasn't brute force that broke it first. It was mobility, ingenuity, and courage on wheels. Jeeps raced ahead through shattered towns and burning fields, dodging sniper fire, ferrying messages and commanders, dragging field guns into position. Some were converted into makeshift ambulances, carrying the wounded over the bridge as shells exploded nearby. General Eisenhower's staff later noted that without the Jeep's speed and adaptability, establishing the bridgehead at Remagen might have taken days longer. That would have cost countless lives. As the Allied advance accelerated, the Jeep became the face of victory in motion. In one village after another, its arrival meant liberation. French farmers cheered when they saw its outline cresting the horizon. Children waved flags and chased behind it as soldiers tossed them chocolate and rations. It was often the first American machine to enter and the last to leave. On the German side, disbelief turned to grim recognition. Captured Wehrmacht officers described Allied mobility as fluid beyond reason. Their own armored divisions, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, were now trapped by fuel shortages and collapsing logistics. Their panzer symbols of might stood immobilized in the mud, while jeeps darted around them like gnats they couldn't swat away. By April 1945, jeeps were everywhere in forests, on bridges, through towns reduced to rubble. They towed artillery, carried surrender flags, and hauled prisoners. Some even drove into concentration camps, the first Allied vehicles to breach those gates of horror. Survivors would later remember seeing that star-marked hood, a symbol that the nightmare was ending. For the men who drove them, the jeep had become more than a tool. It was a comrade, a silent partner in survival. Mechanics gave them names and painted pin-up art on their hoods. They patched bullet holes with tin and canvas. They celebrated every morning the engine still turned over. Even in the final weeks of the war, when fuel was scarce and roads destroyed, jeeps kept rolling. They ran on scavenged gasoline, patched tires, and hope. Soldiers joked that, as long as there's a jeep, we're still moving forward. When the German surrender finally came on May 8, 1945, Europe was a wasteland of wrecked steel and burned cities. Yet in every photograph of victory, somewhere in the frame beside a tank behind a general, or parked at the steps of a ruined chateau, stood a jeep. Muddy, dented, bullet-scarred, but alive. It had crossed deserts, jungles, and mountains. It had endured ice, artillery, and exhaustion. And in doing so, it had become something larger than a machine. It had become a symbol of unstoppable will. The officers who once laughed at it had seen its triumph firsthand. The toy had conquered the continent, and as Europe fell silent, a new question emerged. What would become of this little vehicle now that the world it helped save was finally at peace? Legacy of victory, production, praise, and post-war reports. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a graveyard of machines. Tanks lay split open in the mud, trucks burned out on shattered roads. Yet amid the wreckage, thousands of jeeps still rumbled to life every morning, carrying mail, food, medics, or generals through the ruins. The war had ended, but the jeep story had not. In total, over 640,000 jeeps had been built during the conflict, more than any other Allied vehicle. From Ford's vast assembly lines to Willys Overland's gritty Ohio plants, production had become a symbol of American efficiency. Each jeep required just a fraction of the steel used in a Sherman tank, but its impact was immeasurable. A 1946 U.S. Army report called it the most important piece of non-combat equipment ever developed. General Eisenhower himself ranked it with the airplane, the bazooka, and the atomic bomb as one of the 4 decisive weapons of the Allied victory. British Field Marshal Montgomery praised it for its extraordinary dependability and simplicity. Even Soviet commanders, who received thousands through Lend-Lease, admitted that no Red Army truck could match its versatility. They nicknamed it the Little American Horse. What amazed soldiers most wasn't its speed or power, it was its will to survive. Mechanics told stories of jeeps still running after being riddled with bullets, their engines coughing through holes in the hood. Others recalled jeeps patched together with salvaged wood, wire, and even ration tins. The design had been simple by necessity. Flat panels, no fancy curves, everything accessible with a wrench. That simplicity became genius. A jeep could be repaired by candlelight in the mud, with only basic tools. In a war where everything broke, that made it priceless. Army engineers later joked, "You can fix a jeep with a hammer and hope." When peace returned, the jeep refused to retire. Thousands of surplus vehicles were sold or shipped across the world. Farmers turned them into plows. Doctors used them to reach remote villages. Explorers took them up mountains and across deserts where no road existed. In war-torn Europe, rebuilding crews drove them through rubble to deliver food and medicine. In the Pacific, they became ambulances and school buses. France even built its own post-war version, the Delahaye VLR, inspired entirely by the American Jeep. Back home, Willys quickly understood that the Jeep's legend could live beyond the battlefield. In late 1945, they introduced the CJ-2A civilian Jeep. It carried the same bones as the war model, but with a tailgate, headlights, and a new purpose: peace. Farmers loved it. Ranchers adopted it. Adventurers saw in it the spirit of freedom. Within a few years, Jeep had transformed from a military code name into a household name synonymous with toughness, reliability, and exploration. Ironically, even the Germans, once its loudest critics, came to admire it. Post-war officers of the Wehrmacht studied its design, comparing it to their own over-engineered Kübelwagens. They concluded with reluctant respect that simplicity had defeated sophistication. In interviews, captured officers admitted that Allied speed often came from machines we underestimated. One noted, "Our trucks froze in Russia. Their Jeeps did not." The vehicle that had begun as a desperate wartime experiment had now humbled the very armies that had once seemed unstoppable. By 1948, the Jeep had appeared in newspapers, parades, even Hollywood films. It carried presidents and popes, explorers, and aid workers. It became a symbol of a new kind of heroism, not brute strength but endurance. Not luxury but loyalty. To many veterans, the sound of that little four-cylinder engine became the soundtrack of their memories. They could forget the gunfire, the fear, the hunger, but never the sound of their Jeep grinding through snow at dawn. It had carried them into danger and brought them home again. And though it bore no armor, no turret, no flag, it earned a place in history beside every tank and bomber. In the ashes of World War II, the Jeep didn't just survive the war, it defined what victory looked like. In the quiet years that followed World War II, Europe healed slowly, painfully. Cities rose again from the ashes. Roads were rebuilt where craters once lay. Grass grew over old battlefields. But sometimes when the wind blew across a forgotten field, an old engine's echo seemed to linger, the steady hum of a Jeep rolling across the mud. It wasn't just a machine. It was a promise on wheels, proof that simplicity, courage, and persistence could overcome even the greatest chaos humanity had ever unleashed. The Jeep never roared like a tank or soared like a fighter plane. It didn't carry the glamour of victory parades or the prestige of secret weapons, but it was always there in the background of every triumph, every retreat, every miracle of endurance. It served generals and privates, nurses and medics, spies and engineers. It carried laughter and fear, hope and loss in equal measure. Its true legacy wasn't steel or speed. It was the rarest commodity on the battlefield. Men trusted their Jeeps to start in the cold, to cross rivers, to climb impossible slopes, to bring the wounded home. That trust made it sacred. Decades later, historians would call the Jeep a marvel of design. Engineers would praise its balance and efficiency, but for the men who drove it, it was something more human, a companion that shared the burden of war. Even now, when a modern Jeep drives through rain or snow, it carries that same spirit. Beneath the hum of its engine lies the heartbeat of 1,000 journeys, from Normandy's beaches to the ruins of Berlin, from the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Italy. The Germans once laughed at its size. They saw a toy, not a weapon. But what they didn't understand, what no enemy ever could, was that this little machine represented something they could never build in a factory: adaptability, freedom, and faith in human ingenuity. The Jeep was America's handshake with the world, rough, simple but steady. Wherever it went, it brought the idea that no obstacle was permanent. That movement meant life, that progress could exist even in destruction. In many ways, it became the mechanical reflection of the soldiers who drove it, young, imperfect, and fearless. They too faced terrain that seemed impossible. They too carried the weight of a world at war. And like their Jeeps, they refused to stop until the job was done. When you see a photograph from 1944 of a Jeep splattered with mud, its driver smiling through exhaustion, snow falling on a cracked windshield, you're not just looking at a vehicle. You're looking at the soul of a generation that believed in perseverance over pride, function over form, and resilience over ruin. That's why the Jeep outlived the war, because it wasn't just built for battle, it was built for endurance in every sense of the word. So when history remembers the great engines of the Second World War, the thundering tanks, the mighty bombers, the submarines that prowled the deep, it should also remember the little four-wheeled shadow that followed them all. Quiet, modest, undefeated. A symbol of the ordinary men who turned the tide of history not with size or power, but with stubborn determination. The Jeep rolled through mud, through snow, through shattered cities, and into legend. And in that steady, faithful rhythm of its engine lies one timeless truth. Sometimes the smallest machine carries the greatest strength,